Gettysburg Museum of History Studios. You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
This is the first time I've actually gotten to talk about my work in a public setting. My book came out in late 2017, but then with two little kids and COVID, it sort of limited my availability. Oh, and also living on the West Coast, and also dealing with a state travel ban to more than half of the states. I wasn't able to really travel to talk about my work, and not that many people in California are interested in this. So here we are. I hope that today we're able to talk in depth about the Irish experience in the Civil War and place it in the broader context of the social and military history of this conflict, and also the experiences of immigrant soldiers in general. So with that, I will get started. On September 17, 1862, 3 regiments of the Irish Brigade surged across the field at Antietam. They were met by withering fire from Confederate lines at the Bloody Lane, decimating the ranks of the attackers. Thomas Francis Marr, who had thoughtfully armed his men with smooth-bore, antiquated rifles loaded with buck and ball, with the hopes that this would coax them as close to the enemy as possible, was confident that before such a charge of his Irishmen, the rebel column would give way and be dispersed. William Osborne of the 29th Massachusetts recalled the charge. The volley, he wrote, that played out along the line towards the terrible crest made the hills ring far and wide. It was spitefully done and very effective, for instantly the Confederates fell back from the summit into the sunken road, receiving as they did so several other volleys. Another soldier from the Irish Brigade noted that the shouts of our men and their sudden dash towards the sunken road so startled the enemy that their fire visibly slackened, their line wavered, and squads of 2 or 3 began leaving the road and running into the corn. When the Southerners finally broke, over 400 Irish volunteers lay dead or wounded. 3 months later at Fredericksburg, another 450 men, nearly 45% of the brigade, fell before Confederate guns. Writing home to his family in New York, Captain William Nagel of the 88th New York spoke of the devastation. "Oh, what a terrible day! The destruction of life has been fearful and nothing gained. Irish blood and Irish bones covered that terrible field today. We were slaughtered like sheep, and no result but defeat. I do not know what disposition will be made of us now in our shattered condition." After the war, Colonel C.C. Sanders of the 24th Georgia recalled that the Irish Brigade would receive our well-directed fire steady and firm, and when great gaps were cut through their ranks by the artillery, would reform under the incessant fire, come again, sink down and rise again, trample the dead and wounded underfoot, and press the stone wall of liquid fire, then recede a few feet and come again like an avalanche into the very jaws of death until strength and endurance failed, having been forced back by shell and the deadly minie-ball that no human being could withstand. The field of battle ran great streams of blood, and the immortal Irish Brigade recoiled before the living wall of fire and glory. I know of no charge upon the field of battle in history to compare to the charge of the Irish Brigade at Fredericksburg. Marr's men, though, one outlet noted, were driven to mere slaughter, while a correspondent to the Cincinnati Commercial wrote that, quote, "It could hardly be in human nature for men to show more valor or generals to manifest less judgment." At Gettysburg in July, and I just ran out to the memorial this morning, which was very beautiful, and the battlefield was truly a special place. The Irish Brigade was once again cast into the fray, though their numbers had been significantly depleted. 530 men mustered into battle. 202 died in front of Confederate lines at the Wheatfield and Cemetery Ridge. Private John Ryan recalled of the fighting on July 2nd, where the brigade was being the whole time exposed to heavy fire of musketry, losing many men from the concentrated fire of the enemy who was on both of our flanks. William Smith wrote home that the battle had knocked our regiment all to pieces. There's only 9 in my company now, and all but 108 in the regiment. The 116th Pennsylvania, he wrote, had 900 men when we left Philadelphia, and this fight, I think, will finish them off, and then there will be no more of the 116th. Soon after the guns fell silent on the fields behind us, news outlets across the North reported in dismay the eruption of rioting and violence in New York City. In the wake of the grievous losses of the Irish Brigade, the riots in New York appeared as the climax of Irish-American dissatisfaction with the war effort. Men who had eagerly rushed to the defense of the Union in 1861 reconsidered their support for a war in which Irish soldiers were slaughtered like sheep and in a battle for the emancipation of 4 million slaves. The implementation of the draft and growing perceptions of a rich man's war and a poor man's fight further alienated the impoverished masses in New York City. The riots, which took more than 2 weeks to quell, have since served to traditionally define the rise and fall of Irish support for the war and are believed to have represented Irish anger over the shifting war aims, which marked a turning point in the wartime relationship between this ethnic group and broader society, where the patriotism of 1861 and 1862 was replaced by dissenting political support for the Peace Democrats, and this impacted in many ways the post-war relationships, or it's believed to have impacted in many ways the post-war relationship between immigrants and native-born Americans. In this narrative, the Irish sacrifice on the battlefield was largely overlooked in favor of the revival of nativism and lingering questions of assimilation. And just to point out a few things in the reporting that came out in the wake of the riots, we see that the Irish are prominently presented here, and you can see in these red circles the stereotypical, almost ape-like features in which Irish men are drawn, and sort of this dehumanizes them while at the same time referencing sort of their tendency to violence and rioting, which had been part of the rhetoric for a long time in the years leading up to the war. So if we look at the Irish experience in the Civil War, it's been largely defined, I think, by the rise and fall of ethnic loyalty that coincided with battlefield sacrifice, and simultaneously by perceptions, at least at home, that the Irish were being used as cannon fodder. Certainly in the context of the Irish experience in the United States, as well as the experiences of men who served in the Irish Brigade in the Army of the Potomac, the narrative is understandable. When we discuss the Irish soldiers in the Civil War, we have to keep in mind what oftentimes draws us to their stories, which is a combination of shock. Only 2 units in the Union Army lost more men than the Irish Brigade, and this unit was often at the center of every major battle along the Richmond-Washington front. And also the sentimental attachment to Ireland, connecting to the large number of people who claim Irish ancestry, which is simultaneously tied to the tragedy of the Irish experience and the struggles of the Irish-American experience. Prior to the Civil War, the Irish in Ireland faced 3 decades of economic turmoil, which the famine was the pinnacle of this. I give you this. This is a potato bed in Ireland, a picture of it, and this is sort of how the Irish population and land use was divided on the wake in the lead up to the famine. So there's around 8 million Irish in Ireland at the lead up to the famine. The potato was the primary source of food for these men, women, and children, and also for their animals. Irish were not allowed to own land because of the penal codes, and they were largely driven to plots of land about a quarter of an acre in size. So reliant on the Irish were the Irish on potatoes that we see them eating between 12 to 15 pounds of potatoes a day. It was incredibly nutritious, but overly relied upon. When the famine happened, the famine was a fungus that impacted the potatoes once they were dug up, and it caused them to rot once they hit air. The Irish suffered immensely. The population from 8, I kind of went off script there, but the population of 8 million was cut in half, with 2 million men, women, and children dead of starvation and disease, and another 2 million forced to flee across the Atlantic Ocean to the United States and Canada, with a percentage of them also going to England in search of work. The tragedy of the famine and the sadness of the immigrant experience has remained a prominent component of the Irish imagination for the last 150 years, which was compounded by the equally devastating English response, which was embodied by nationalist John Mitchell's famous quip that God brought the blight, but England brought the famine. And for many, the famine was a metaphor of around 700 years of English mistreatment of Irish Catholics that still is ongoing in the political rhetoric of today. In the United States, the experiences of Irish immigrants and their children are intrinsically appealing, in large part because it is a story of overcoming adversity. Fleeing tyrannical rule and social and economic devastation, the exiled Irish men and women crowded into America's urban centers, where they struggled for survival in impossible conditions in what become urban slums. Compounding the economic crisis that many of these desperately poor immigrants face was the social stigma and xenophobia that followed them, their religion in particular. And so this is a like 1880s. It's a photograph of 5 Points, but it's very similar to what we see in the Irish tenements of the pre-Civil War era. So in particular, this one on your right is compelling. This is a basement apartment home to, I believe, a family of 6, and you can see there's no windows, no running water, no toilets, right? When we read accounts of 5 Points in the antebellum period, we read accounts of men having to walk over boards that are strung between streets because the sewage is knee-deep. But the Irish face stigma, in part because their alleged allegiance to the Pope, their cultural fondness for alcohol, a seemingly blind commitment to the democratic political machine, and the general instability of the spaces in which they lived, which is often attributed to Irish presence. And they became thus targets of nativists in the years before the war. And animosity between these groups has contributed to the controversial argument that emerged in the 20th century that the Irish weren't viewed as white within a racially divided antebellum society and had to earn that whiteness over time as their economic conditions improved, as they became more assimilated into American society. The 19th century America that these Irish immigrants arrived was one of incredible change and growth as American industry and urban centers boomed almost overnight and became home to these exiles who clustered and became visible and vocal members of what we term as ethnic wards. And in this discussion, we're specifically talking about places like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. And these ethnic wards simultaneously, as centers of the Irish immigrant experience, became known for poverty, disease, drunkenness, and crime, which contributed to alienation of these Irish Catholic immigrants in the years before the war. The rise of the nativists, or Know-Nothing Party, in the 1840s and 50s reflected a hesitancy to embrace these immigrants, at least from the national perspective, and underscored the fears that Irish Catholics would cause instability if allowed to fully participate in American society. So as we see the lead up to the war, political schisms only exacerbated the questions surrounding ethnic loyalties, especially given the strong adherence of these Irish to the Democratic Party and the hesitancy of this group, or at least their leaders, to embrace anti-slavery in any form, which was tied to fears of labor competition in these urban spaces. These attitudes continued through the war, and as we talk about the rise and fall of ethnic support, we often see these attitudes as cited as motives behind the disloyal act of these adopted citizens. In 1861, the onset of war caused the Irish, who had been so hesitantly welcomed into American society, to appeal for an opportunity to prove their allegiance to their adopted nation. Indeed, many scholars, including sociologist Warren Young, have stressed the relationship between military service and sacrifice on the battlefield and notions of inclusion. And we see this in many studies on nationalism, this idea that if you're willing to die for this entity, then that is proof of your loyalty and proof of your identity as part of that larger thing, that larger nation. The struggle for scholars, though, when looking at the Irish experience, is that when viewed through the lens of the Irish Brigade, the sacrifice did not appear to lend itself to acceptance. And this becomes increasingly evident after July of 1863 and was reinforced in the wake of the years with the revival of nativism across the country. So this is the narrative with which I began my own research. I mean, I remember I started at Fordham in 2007, and my mentor said, "So what are you going to do?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to look at the Irish in the Civil War." And he was like, "Okay, what?" And that led to around a year of anxiety and panic as I tried to figure out what exactly I was going to do. And in reviewing the literature and reviewing what scholars that came before me had written, one of the things I found so striking was that few scholars, no scholars in fact, had actually identified what an Irish regiment was. And there was a tendency to stereotype and draw broad relationships between units, symbolism, and ethnic background, relying largely on the assumption that Irish America was a cohesive immigrant community, that Irish regiments were manifestations first and foremost of this community, and hinging upon three widely accepted observations about the Irish American immigrant community. First, that Irish Americans were largely alienated from America prior to the war. Second, that certain universal characteristics applied to Irish regiments, specifically that these units were composed primarily of poor, unskilled Irish-born volunteers supported by a singular urban ethnic neighborhood, and they believed that military service would lead to their inclusion. And third, that Irish Americans collectively withdrew their support from the war after the summer of 1863. So I was only given 40 minutes, and I'm 20 minutes in, so I will try to get through all of this as quickly as I can so we can have time for questions. In 1863, a newspaper editor in Dublin, Ireland, claimed that the Civil War has given us back our military reputation in its pristine luster. The value and sacrifice of the Irishmen who strove and fell so heroically before the batteries at Fredericksburg, and, importantly, in 100 other fights of the war, have scattered to the wind the malignant calmness of traitors and open foes and made manifest to the world the might of Irish prowess. No truer words were spoken, and notable here is the broader view of the war as seen from across the Atlantic Ocean. For though the Irish Brigade became symbolic of the Irish war effort, in Ireland this unit was only part of the ethnic experience. My work focuses on three other Irish regiments, the 9th Connecticut, the 17th Wisconsin, and the 23rd Illinois. These regiments all served loyally throughout the war, and the experience of the soldiers illustrates that both the volunteers and those back at home face complex realities linked to both international and national worldviews, but most importantly and intimately, they were tied to their local communities and their local experiences. So, first, why these regiments? Well, to start, none served in the Irish Brigade or with the Army of the Potomac at any point in the war. The 23rd Illinois was in the Shenandoah Valley after '64, and the 9th Connecticut was at Deep Bottom towards in the Bermuda Hundred towards the end of the war. But none were with the Irish Brigade, even though they all had connections in some way to the soldiers of the Irish Brigade. And many of those connections dated to the antebellum period. Many of the officers in these regiments were part of the Fenian movement, which was a transatlantic Irish nationalist movement that emerged in 1858. And they were connected in that way and in other ways, but they were not unified under a single flag. Each was organized in states with relatively large Irish presence, but ones that are often overlooked in studies of the Irish immigrant experience. And in order to understand the nature of Irish America during the 19th century, we as historians must move away from analyzing the Irish in major urban centers such as New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. Simply because if you think of it in this way, New York did have the largest concentration of Irish immigrants in the country in 1860. It's a fact, right? We can't get away from that. But the reality is the New York experience was and still is exceptional. And I don't think that we can define immigrant life through a lens that would be synonymous to a first-time visitor coming to America, going to New York City and saying this is how all Americans live, right? It seems like a flawed way to look at the experiences of Irish in general. All three units identified as Irish regiments, all flew green flags, all had Catholic chaplains, and as I mentioned, many of the officers identified as part of the Fenian movement. And importantly, all three served heroically on battlefields and were championed at home for their loyal service to the Union throughout the course of the war. On April 15, 1861, Richard Yates called for 6,000 Illinois volunteers to put down rebellion in the southern states. Recruiting started briskly in the state, and by April 25th, a number of regiments had already been dispatched east, and nearly 2,500 volunteers crowded Chicago, eagerly awaiting further call to arm. The Irish in Illinois answered the call to serve with the same enthusiasm as their friends and neighbors. As early as April 17th, Chicago papers noted that several of our Irish companies were zealously brushing up on their tactics with good zeal and loyalty that gave to the Irish soldiers a name to live in all military annals. From 200 to 300 of these men will be in readiness to be offered to the government on call. And across Illinois, local papers reported similar outpourings of enthusiasm from their adopted citizens. On April 19th, James Mulligan, who was a Democrat and Fenian, received orders to fully equip and arm your command, the Shields Guards, immediately and hold yourself at readiness to march. A prominent lawyer whose parents had immigrated from Ireland, Mulligan had emerged as the leader of Chicago's Irish Americans in the antebellum period, and he sought to organize an Irish Brigade. And in imagining this Irish Brigade, he reached out to Irishmen from across Illinois and the Midwest, seeking their willingness to serve with him. And he was met with both enthusiasm, but also hesitancy, because many Irishmen, like their American counterparts, wanted to go fight, and they did not want to wait for a regiment to form. He asked Patrick Dunn of the Emmett Guards in Peoria if the Irishmen from Peoria would join the Shields Guard. Dunn replied, "Nothing would give our company so much pleasure as to unite their fortunes with their fellow countrymen of the Irish Brigade, if, he underscored, you and your men will be quick to see action against your Confederate foes." Mulligan was able to have his unit accepted as a federal regiment soon thereafter, and the acceptance of the 23rd Illinois by the federal government led to a pouring in of letters from across the Midwest requesting to join the regiment. One Irishman wrote, "On receiving our daily paper this morning, the first thing under the telegraphic head is the acceptance through your noble exertions in Chicago. All hail to you. There are several Irishmen who would very much like to join an Irish regiment in preference of any others." Thomas Fitzgibbons, a route agent on the Detroit and Milwaukee Railroad, wrote to Mulligan on May 21st, seeking a commission in the regiment. "I have seen it telegraphed from Washington that your brigade was accepted," he wrote, "and being desirous of enrolling my name amongst a band of men activated by such noble and holy impulses, I now address you. I have been in militia service of my adopted country since I was 16, and saw a 4-month service under Walker in Nicaragua. If you, Colonel, can afford me such a position as your brigade, as my past services and military education would warrant me accepting, I shall hold myself ready for your marching orders." By the time the 23rd marched south to meet the Confederate threat in Missouri, it represented men from Chicago, Detroit, Ottawa, Earlville, and a dozen other towns and cities from across Illinois. Connecticut's initial quota under Lincoln's first call for troops in April of 1861 was a single regiment, yet the overwhelming number of volunteers encouraged the governor to muster 3 regiments into service within the first few days after the war began. In the 3 weeks after the call for troops, they had mustered in 54 full companies, despite the fact that they lacked any real ability or infrastructure to supply these troops. The 9th Connecticut's Irish Regiment, began organizing in late April in response to the initial calls for troops, and as in Chicago, Governor Buckingham attempted to bring the Irish into the fold, offering Irish full commissions to men chosen by volunteers without the usual formalities of military order. Though the Irishmen were initially sent home due to the overwhelming number of volunteers, by mid-September recruiting resumed, spurred on in large part by the action of the 69th New York at Bull Run and the heroic stand of Mulligan's Irish Brigade at the Battle of Lexington in September. Enthusiasm for the Union from Connecticut's Irish regiments was overwhelming and resounding. Observers in Middletown, for example, reported that Irish residents have, quote, shown a great readiness to volunteer, and several are enrolled in the company which is just formed. The Irish population, they continued, are unanimous in their wish and determination to support the government. In spite of the prophecies of many to the contrary, we have not heard of a single Irishman who has shown a disposition to prove false to the stars and stripes. When the Emmett Guards of New Haven volunteered their services, some regiments saw the irony in the act, recalling that the arms of these men, as these companies, as composed of Catholics, adopted citizens, were taken from them under a boldly imputed doubt of their loyalty. There was a nativist in Connecticut and Massachusetts. Nativists had taken over the government, and they demanded that the Irish regiments put their arms down because these regiments couldn't be trusted or couldn't be loyal. Let justice be done to them, and by a generous acknowledgement of their loyalty and the restoration of their character, such soldiers cannot be spared. In June, a Catholic priest in Hartford called for every man who can leave his family to enlist. This is the first country that Irishmen have ever had that he can call his own. There are two classes who I despise most, cowards and traitors, and those who can enlist and do not are either one or the other. None in Connecticut, another observer wrote, hastens to don the armor of his country and to strike in her defense as much as the much aligned and prescribed Irish Catholic. As the 9th Connecticut took shape, newspapers emphatically noted that, like the gallant 69th New York, the Irishmen of this section are among the foremost defenders of the constitutional government. On November 4th, 1861, the 9th Connecticut left New Haven for Lowell, where they joined Benjamin Butler's New England Expeditionary Force that would take them to the Gulf of Mexico, New Orleans, and Vicksburg. As these men moved to Lowell, the Irish from Wisconsin were only just beginning to organize, and this reflected a number of things, a number of themes that we see in Wisconsin. Number one is that early enlistment in Wisconsin did not take on ethnic lines like we see in other states, but also the Irish population in Wisconsin lacked clear leadership. A steamship had sunk, the Lady Elgin, had sunk on the way back from the Democratic convention in Chicago, and many of the prominent Irish from Wisconsin had drowned in that disaster. And so they were really without any significant core of leadership in the state. 50,000 Irish nevertheless called the Badger State their home, but their arrival and settlement patterns differed substantially from their countrymen to the south and the east. On average, the Irish who arrived in Wisconsin spent 7 years in other states prior to their moving west, meaning many immigrants undertook the move only after they had achieved some degree of economic stability. And Wisconsin's Irish do not appear to have conformed to the stereotype of these immigrants as urban pioneers, but rather settled seemingly haphazardly across the state in smaller communities. As the nation moved towards war, questions of Irish loyalty reemerged, and public assertions of fealty quickly put these fears to rest. Democrats throughout the state openly disavowed secession. Our republic, they cried, would cease to be a refuge for the oppressed of all nations if broken in twain, and under no circumstances would their condition be tolerable in a Southern slave confederacy. Under such circumstances of peril, it behooves every good citizen to stand firmly by the Union. Even before the first shots were fired in Charleston, observers in Milwaukee enthusiastically noted the outspoken patriotism displayed by the Irish during their annual St. Patrick's Day celebration. Never before has it been our good fortune to be present at a gathering of the sons of Erin, they wrote, where so much true Irish heart and feeling was manifested. So genuine and unselfish love of native land exhibited, so much loyalty to their adopted land displayed. Disloyal Irish, another outlet noted, were few, designing, traitorous demagogues. For the Irish people on this continent are loyal to the Union, the Constitution, and the government, and will support them by every means in their power. The organization of the 17th Wisconsin began in the fall of 1861 and was spurred on by reports of the successful service of the Irish in other areas. Let the Irishmen of Watertown and the surrounding country not be hind-held, noted an observer in Wisconsin. Irishmen rallied to the rescue of the gallant 69th. Cannot the Irishmen do as well as their sister states? Another noted that our gallant countrymen of the 69th have covered themselves with imperishable glory. Let there be 10,000 Irishmen on the south bank of the Potomac in 20 days, their battle cry being Corcoran, rescued if living, avenged if dead. The Mar Guards soon began organizing in Madison, and the Daily Patriot reported confidently that these men would distinguish themselves on the field of battle. What I find interesting about this is the Irish organization in this state especially is very driven by the success of Irish in other areas, and there seems to be an association, regardless of ethnic background, of Irish regiments as being exceptional under battle. So I think you could be thinking, why is this different? These themes seem to follow the organization of Irish regiments across the Union. All shared a common desire to prove their worth, their common desire to prove their loyalty and fealty to their adopted country, and we see an ideological connection between Irish in these different areas. And I think that that's important. So in part, right, we can't dismiss this idea that the Irish were connected at some ideological level with each other, and that military service was seen as part of this bigger picture. But these regiments each have unique characteristics that, when analyzed, I think helps us better understand the soldiers that served, the experiences of the communities, and the Irish experience in the United States broadly. So importantly, and I'm going to show you some maps, and these maps come from a database that I created of over 5,000 soldiers that served in these three regiments, and that came from primarily from muster and descriptive rolls of these three units. So one of the things that I'd like to point out in particular, and as we scroll through these maps, is although we see areas in which more Irish enlisted, there is not a singular ward or ethnic neighborhood that supported the development of either of any of these three regiments. The numbers that we see, both from the regiments and from the census data from 1860, show that ethnic neighborhoods that we tend to talk about were actually rather diverse. Of the three largest cities in my study, New Haven, Chicago, and Milwaukee, the most Irish neighborhood, Ward 5 of New Haven, was only 37% Irish, and it only had 1,095 residents. And only 1,095 residents of that ward were of military age. So if we're looking at the 9th Connecticut then, here, this is a map of the 9th Connecticut. For the presumption of the relationship between the regiment and the neighborhood to be valid, every Irish-born man of military age in Ward 5 of New Haven would have had to enlist in order for the regiment to be filled. Of these same three major cities, only 5% of the total number of Irishmen of military age enlisted from the entire city of New Haven. Only 4.8% of the number of Irish military age enlisted from Chicago, and only 0.7% of the Irish of military age enlisted from Milwaukee. And so what we can see, right, and if we look here, the colors, right, the yellow is the number of Irish-born men from that city. The red is other ethnic backgrounds. And then the size represents the proportion of men from those cities that enlisted in these regiments. So you can see the 23rd Illinois is scattered from Detroit all the way to southern Illinois, from towns and cities across those states, as well as Indiana. In Connecticut, we can see, a significant number of companies are formed in various towns and cities across the state. The 9th Connecticut was the most Irish of the three regiments. Around 80%, around 55% of the soldiers were Irish born. And in the 23rd Illinois, it was less than, it was around 40%, and in the 17th Wisconsin, there were less than 30% of the soldiers were Irish born, right? So which also leads to other questions about what an ethnic regiment was. And then you can see from Wisconsin is very scattered when it came to enlistment practices. I think that the diversity in these regiments reflected a lack of homogeneity, especially even among the most intimate levels of association and local community. One of the things that we see in these regiments is the enlistment of a number of American-born and ethnic volunteers. And what I found in my research into these men is that more often than not, these men enlisted, yes, because it was an Irish regiment, and for some men that sounded cool, right? But also they enlisted because their friends were enlisting in these regiments, right? So when you look at these soldiers, when you pull their pension files, when you're reading their affidavits, they oftentimes say, yeah, I enlisted because We went with the foreman of our lumber mill and 5 other guys. We all enlisted together. Or a brother enlisted and then 4 other men from the local community enlisted. So we see all these sort of nuanced relationships that transcended ethnic background, especially as we go further west, especially as we move into the small towns and small cities in these areas. So I want to also point out here, right, if we look at the number of men in the towns, okay, we have a breakdown. I did a breakdown of the major cities in each of the regiments, and I just wanted to give you a suggestion as to why, to observers, these regiments may have seemed more Irish than they actually were, right? So if we look at if we look at the 9th Connecticut, for example, and we look at Meriden, which is one of the a very outspoken political city with a very prominent Democratic newspaper. So of the 2,600 men between the ages of 13 and 15 in Meriden in 1860, I databased all the census from these cities. So that's how I have these numbers. There were 495 men of military age. Right? So that's 19% of the population, right? But if we look at number of soldiers from the town that enlisted versus number of Irish soldiers, like 37 soldiers enlisted from the town and 32 of those men were Irish, right? So on a local level then, when we see these enlistment patterns, what people are saying, oh, this is an Irish regiment. This is composed of the Irishmen of our town, even though the numbers are relatively small, right? We can see the same thing in Ottawa, for example. 27% of the town is, does this have a clicker here? Oh, yeah. So 27% of the town is Irish men of military age, but 62% of the men who enlisted in the regiment were of Irish descent, right? So we can start to tease this out a little bit more and understand why the perception of these regiments at the local level was that they were Irish, especially in areas where we see large numbers of men who were Irish born. Now, this doesn't hold up in all cases, right? In Detroit, 172 men enlisted, only 43 were Irish. Right? In Hartford, 78 men enlisted, only 36 were Irish. So looking at these statistics, we see that it's a relatively diverse group that joins these regiments, even though the perception is that they are of Irish descent. Okay, another thing that I just want to talk about, with the Irish, we often talk about their socioeconomic struggles, and one of the things that we see in the data, especially outside of the New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, is that it's actually much more vibrant than we tend to associate with. Right? We know that 70% of the Irish in New York worked in low-paying, unskilled positions, and their visibility likely contributed to nativist backlash. But the experience of the Irish in Illinois was different. The occupations of Irish-born men in Illinois suggest a vibrant and socially mobile immigrant community. In Chicago, for example, less than 50% of Irish were unskilled workers. This is the city of Chicago as a whole. And artisans composed a sizable portion of the population. In New Haven, less than 40% of the Irish were listed as laborers. Nearly 45% of the men in New Haven worked as skilled workers or artisans, many of them with substantial property. In Milwaukee, less than half the Irish-born men were unskilled laborers. More than half of the unskilled laborers were property owners. So what we see is a much more vibrant cross-section of skilled men with property, and this plays out into the recruiting. And when we look at the Irish regiments from these states, we see that, in fact, it's a much more vibrant cross-section of employment, and I could break down all the numbers into more specifics, but for the sake of time, I'm not going to. But what we see is that there are significant numbers of, right, if we look at this as all volunteers, around 48% artisan, 37% unskilled in the 9th Connecticut. If we look at just the Irish volunteers, right, we see that more Irish volunteers are unskilled than not, but nevertheless, it's not this overwhelming, destitute group of men, right? Oftentimes people are like, oh, you studied the Irish in the Civil War. Did you see gangs in New York, right, where they're getting off the boat and going right into the army, right? That's not what we see in these spaces, right? These men they have skills. They are many times, in cases, artisans. In many cases, if they are laborers, they do have property, right? So it's a much more inclusive dynamic cross-section than we tend to associate with Irish soldiers and Irish communities in general. And I think that this is an important thing to keep in mind. So, saving time for questions, I want to say that these relationships, both in enlistment, right, the ways in which we see diversity in enlistment, but also the vibrant employment of these men, mean that in the cities that they came from, they're much more included in their communities. So when Irish units formed from places like Earlville, Illinois, or Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, or Waterbury, Connecticut, the locals cheered these men. Women formed sewing circles, volunteers enlisted with friends and colleagues, Irish and otherwise, and they were seen as part of that community rather than a disconnected ethnic regiment. And this is key to when we start to talk about the issues that were associated with the draft riots and Irish exclusion after the war. These relationships impacted perceptions of the war. When James Mulligan surrendered his forces to Sterling Price in September of 1861, he was heralded at home as a hero and a true American. He was compelled at last to yield to superior numbers after 4 days of hard fighting. Chicago has every reason to be proud of this brave Irish officer. Mulligan became, in a sense, the idealized American warrior, and his image is printed, and his stories and his heroics are printed across the nation in the fall of 61. And this sort of belies, when we talk about the Irish and when we talk about nativist fears in the antebellum period, the nativist fears are that the Irish would not be willing to fight, right? And here Mulligan is proving them wrong. In March of 1862, the men of the 17th Wisconsin mutinied. A fire broke out in the regiment's quarters in Camp Randall, consuming nearly 200 feet of barracks and killing 2 soldiers. And the fire stoked a lingering sense of animosity among many volunteers because rumors persisted that it was not an accident, but rather an act of protest. Sort of sums up everything. Sorry. Got the rest of it. Designed to keep the regiment from moving south to join Grant's army. The men were upset in the days leading up to their departure. Rumors circulated among the ranks that the 16th Wisconsin had been paid before the regiment headed south, and the men of the Irish 17th would be the first volunteer unit to leave the state without receiving their back pay. These rumors left the men cursing in the tongue wherein they were born, and on March 19th, the day after the fire, which also happened to be 2 days after St. Patrick's Day, so I do think that there was alcohol involved. In a rather demoralizing state, a large number of men declared they would not go to St. Louis without pay, and though some officers forced some of the men on trains south, a large number of men barricaded themselves in Camp Randall and refused to go. The mutiny persisted until a detachment of the 23rd Illinois arrived from Chicago, when Colonel Mulligan's men of Lexington notoriety with several officers arrived well armed. Every soldier remaining in camp, about 200, suddenly awoke at early dawn with a bayonet, not of his own, at his breast. Such a surprise party you never saw. Right? So we have this moment in which this Irish regiment's mutinying, right? It's an act of disloyalty in any sense. But those at home did not view it as such. In fact, newspaper outlets, commentators, even the governor noted that it was within their rights as citizens to resist being sent without pay. They were citizen soldiers, and therefore they were engaging in democratic protest over their right to pay, which I found very interesting with regards to sort of this link that we tend to have between questions of immigrant loyalty and military service. For the men of the 9th Connecticut, the war was not glorious at all, with the exception of their participation in the Battle of Baton Rouge, in which the regiment won fame at the home front. The war was spent in garrison duty and across from Vicksburg. No other regiment had the number of court-martials that the 9th Connecticut had in New Orleans. 1 out of every 9 men was court-martialed, most for drunken disorderly conduct, which some people say, well, it's because they were Irish, but I think it's because there were a bunch of 18-year-olds in New Orleans. And in the summer of 62, outside of Vicksburg, nearly 90% of the unit fell sick while trying to complete an ill-fated canal to reroute the Mississippi. Yet at home, service and sacrifice was never once publicly damned in the manner that we see in reference to the Irish Brigade, and this is important. When the draft riots broke out in 1863, responses on the home front in Connecticut, Illinois, and Wisconsin were interesting to say the least. Men and women in all three states immediately distanced themselves from the radicalism of the mob in the summer and fall of 1863. The rioters, claimed newspapers in Wisconsin, were encouraged by men for whom robbing and plunder was the main object. New York was a city of thieves, gamblers, garroters, shoulder hitters, thugs, and scoundrels of every conceivable hue and grade. Most of this class are never at ease unless they are in a fight. We hope, the editors of the Daily Patriot noted, that no resistance will disgrace the West, but that, if any think they have cause to resort to the courts. Matthew Hart, a Catholic priest from New Haven, wrote that far from being organized to resist the draft, the mob turned to be one of the most heinous, murdering, robbing, burning crowds that ever cursed any city in the world. It was made up of pickpockets, thieves, robbers, blackleaves, garroters, and all that class that infests New York. Many saw this as a scheme for plunder. Opposition to the draft made a pretext. I read about the riot in New York. Thomas Nablin wrote from the 9th Connecticut. It was a pity that one of those murderers should escape. I hope the police will ferret out every one of them and hang them. You will find that if the soldiers are called on, they will do their duty. Those sympathizers in the North has done more to injure the cause than 100,000 rebels in arms. I hope the whole of them will be hanged. In Milwaukee, the Sentinel noted, Irish Americans, even the humblest of class, bring with it to this country not one particle of prejudice against the color race. They acquire it here under the debasing influence of demagogues. No practical Catholic has ever violated law and order in this country. The so-called Catholics who disturb the public peace are Catholics only in name. It continues. Although the draft riots were nationally symbolized to represent Irish dissatisfaction with the war, I just would like to conclude by saying that when we look at local communities, when we look at the communities that supported these regiments outside of these cities, we see a number of important historical themes, important social themes. First is there is a close relationship between the Irish and their adopted spaces, and that relationship bred support throughout the war. We don't see dissatisfaction growing in Irish areas or even in those states themselves when Irish regiments are experiencing not great treatment, or what would appear not to be great treatment under military authorities, especially for those in New York. And the Irish remained staunchly loyal to the cause and rejected the auspices of the draft riot vocally. So that's sort of my big picture. I'd be happy to talk more detail about some of these themes or answer any questions that you might have. So thank you so much.
Looks like we have about 10 minutes for questions.
Sorry. Can I take a picture so my kids actually believe that I do something? I'm serious.
How old are your kids?
11, almost 7, and almost 5. Yeah.
How about a video of applause again?
What's that?
How about do a video of our applause?
They had an opportunity to come out with me, but none of them wanted to, and they went to Great Wolf Lodge instead. So here I am. Anyway, I'd be happy to answer any questions that y'all might have.
Yeah, sort of a two-pronged question.
Sure.
I know there was a lot of ethnic tension in
Yeah.
the Irish sentiment, and you were describing regiments that were mixed ethnic background. There were a lot of
Yeah.
Irish, but there were also a lot of others. I just wonder, how did that play out within the regiments?
Yes.
Number one. And number two is, I know that some of the German regiments apparently were predominantly German-speaking, and I'm wondering if the Irish regiments had a lot of Irish-speaking, or if they
Yeah.
learned English.
No, that's a great question. So, the tensions that I see in these regiments are largely around what we see in every other regiment. So it's fighting over promotion, it's fighting over leadership of the companies and the regimental levels. There's not a lot of, there doesn't appear to be a lot of infighting, over ethnic lines or across ethnic lines. In fact, right, the most diverse regiment, the 17th of Wisconsin, right, has a significant number of Germans in it, and it appears, right, that there is relative harmony among these men, right? So there aren't those divides. I initially thought that there might be, especially when we see more diverse units in the West. But the reality is, I mean, I think that the fighting that takes place is over promotion. So, like in the 17th of Wisconsin, John Doran, who's the colonel that organizes the regiment, by 63, the men under him don't like him, so they're writing back to the governor, trying to get other guys promoted, and there's a lot of fighting that way that ultimately leads to Doran's resignation. But I don't think that's not uniquely Irish by any means, and it just seems to be typical of what you see in a war in which promotions can be very politicized. And in terms of Irish language, I didn't come across any evidence of that. That doesn't mean there wasn't, but I didn't come across any evidence of that in my regiments. Yeah, please.
One of the tropes about the Irish Civil War is they were training to go back
sure.
and fight. And, did you find any evidence of that?
Well, that was what my book was supposed to be on. So I wanted to write on the Fenians, and so the Fenians organized in the United States and in Ireland beginning in 1858, and there's a lot of material on that, and there were efforts to get the Irish back to Ireland to fight in the rising that occurred in 67. But what we see happen is twofold, is that I think the Irish get war weary by 64, and there's not a lot of support necessarily but they actually lease the boats. So, I mean, you have guys in New York leasing boats to put guys on to take back to Ireland. There are a few accounts. Lawrence O'Brien of the 9th Connecticut actually goes back and fights in the rising. I don't even know if we can call it a rising. It's very mismanaged. But he's captured and he's imprisoned, and then he escapes prison with a key made from a bar of soap, very Eamon de Valera-like. But, there's a letter from his uncle that I have in 63 that his uncle says, you Irish Americans, we don't care about that here. You guys have much more of a passion for it where you are. And, I think that if that impetus existed, it did in 61. There's a famous moment where Michael Corcoran refuses to present the 69th New York for the parade in honor of the Prince of Wales in New York City in 1860. And, newspapers say, well, it's because he didn't want to present his regiment to the English monarchy. But the reality is that the Fenian head center, John O'Mahony, ordered him not to. He sends him a letter. So here you have, right, an officer in the New York State Militia who receives a letter from Fenian that says, do not bring your regiment to bear in that parade. And so, we have those instances where you see the Irish preparing for this, but it never manifested itself, with the exception of then, I think, 3 raids into Canada, which were, and I think that the issue as a scholar of the Fenians, so I always said I wanted to write about the Fenians once, I actually had the gravitas to do so. But the irony of the Fenians is that people look at their invasions of Canada and they see it as like this bumbling, comedic, like, oh, those silly drunk Irishmen. But the reality is that they were serious in their organization up to that point, and then the Civil War just I think, really tore that apart. And then mismanagement in Ireland by James Stephens was a problem.
So we'll start. Thank you for your presentation.
Yep.
And since you went there and mentioned the gangs of New York and
Yeah.
that scene, which is pretty ridiculous where they show them coming off.
Yeah. It happened. No.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. I know it didn't happen, or at least not like that.
Yeah.
But was there, often these things, the kernel of truth, or what they say, was there a perception that it was going to happen?
Here's what I get from everything that I've looked at is that, the Irish that wanted to fight were going to fight, and they were going to volunteer to fight. And if the Irish didn't want to fight, they didn't have to fight, right? Even with the draft riots, like, people always say, well, the Irish resisted the drafts because they were so poor and they saw it as a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. Well, the reality is, if you look at they were great at avoiding the draft, right? So Matthew Hart, who's the chaplain of the 9th Connecticut, he writes that the draft. He writes to Thomas Cahill that news of the draft has sent the Irish boys from New Haven away like chaff in the wind, right? You can't get registered for the draft if you're not there. So they would just leave town, right? But also in every state, you have these Irishmen, and really not just Irishmen, anybody in general, they'll put ads in the newspapers. They'll say, we'll form an organization, right? It's $300 to get out of the draft. If we get 10 guys and each puts $30 in, the chances are, and it's not just individuals, newspapers are saying if you join an organization, the chances are 1 in 10 that you might get drafted and you can pay out the commutation fee in that way. Right? So this whole idea that the Irish were so poor and had so little agency that they were just forced off the boat is to me, from everything that I've read, it's ludicrous, right? I mean, there were jobs, there were opportunities during the war for those who didn't have to fight, right? The economy's booming, especially the further west you move, and so that's more of this. I think it's designed to have us really, hurting for the Irish, right? Hurting for them, I think, rather than any sort of real like that happened or that, and then it's part of the lost cause myth that the Union only won because they forced all these guys into the army that didn't want to fight. And I think that we have to take that with a grain of salt as well.
You said that there was a perception that the Irish brigades were used as cannon.
Sure.
Were they? There was a lot of cannon fodder.
Yeah, I don't know. You read Marr's account of Antietam. I mean, I think that he put his regiment in the front, right? Because he believed that the Irish were excellent fighters. I mean, to the point where you make a conscious decision to arm them with 1847 smoothbores and buck and ball shots so they'll do a better charge. I mean, that doesn't seem. I mean, that was his decision, right? Because he didn't want his guys to fire from too far away. He wanted them to get in front of the enemy. So no, I don't think that they were consciously used in that way. But the Irish, even in World War I too, the Irish claimed that their troops were being used in the same manner. So I do think that there's a perception, or there tends to be a perception, where you have heavy losses, then there was some conscious means by those in power of putting the Irish in harm's way. But I do think that there was more of a decision, at least at Antietam and Fredericksburg, by regimental leadership to. I mean, they call themselves the Clear the Way Battalion. I mean, it's.
Fredericksburg battle tour guide really stresses their tremendous bravery.
Yeah.
Super positive.
Yeah.
Tones that they got closer to the second row than anybody else.
Right. Right.
I had a kind of like a couple of questions. One is, do you feel that in your research, from what you came across, that the Irish, when they were in their brigades, that they really had like more of a profound sense of pride serving, like having a collective identity, and also with this, with the discrimination against the Irish, did you find any evidence that they perhaps did not acquire the same military pay, like in a similar manner to black soldiers?
No, there was no evidence of that. I think that when you look at the Irish regiments, so the pride. I mean, the way that certainly you have these core group of community leaders who are organizing the regiment with the pomp and circumstance that comes with this, and it's also tied to rhetoric about Irish manhood, right? There's a lot of focus on sort of the denial of Irish manhood in Ireland by the British, and this is an opportunity to prove oneself, to prove one's manhood from a space that's been so far denied, and I think intrinsically. Right, we know that men cognizantly choose to enlist in these regiments, and there's a sense of connection around sort of this ethnic flair. But then, to me, there's also the question of like, did these guys choose to do it because it was a bunch of Irishmen and they felt connected to that, or did they choose it in the same way, like when you have a high school football team that calls themselves the Fighting Irish, in the same way they're trying to capitalize on University of Notre Dame's prominence, right? So were men attracted to the regiment because the ethnic relationship, or did they think it was like cool to join an Irish regiment? And I think when you look at the recruiting and the enthusiasm and the diversity, I think that many men felt like it was, joining an Irish regiment meant that you were better than other regiments, that regiment would be better than, that they were part of something, a group that was more fierce than, if that makes sense. But in camp, in all of these regiments, there's very few ethnic references. There's very few ethnic references in the papers after 61 and 62 about their ethnicity. I mean, they are Union regiments, and they're referred to as such at home. And the men don't necessarily refer to themselves through an ethnic lens, which I think is very important.
Maybe a quick question about Pennsylvania as an example. It seems like
Yeah.
the anthracite and bituminous coal regions in Pennsylvania, that was the very heart of the draft resistance.
Right.
And that was a lot of Irish, and if you look at 1864 election results, McClellan did extremely well in the Irish precincts. I just didn't know if you had, was Pennsylvania perhaps different than some of the other states?
Yeah, Bob Sandow has a good book, Deserter Country, about that region, about the.
Bernardino had a book called
Yeah.
Another Civil War.
Yeah, and I do think that there's, especially in those rural areas, right, there is a tendency to see resistance that's tied with just the socioeconomic realities of what happens when you remove a person from the household and what that does to the household economy, and then tied to the fact that wages are going up in those areas as a result of the war, right? But there's, I think that the difference is that when you look at New York City as opposed to those areas, what's the focus on the rioters in New York City outside of New York, right, from these areas is just that's just what New Yorkers are like. They're just out of control, right? And that it doesn't represent sort of us broadly. And I found that very compelling. And I also found very compelling the idea, the sort of resistance to the idea that Irish were combating emancipation. And when you look at the numbers, one of the things that stands out, for example, is that in Milwaukee, there were only, I think, because I databased the census, in 1860 there were only 17 African American men in Milwaukee in 1860, right? So this whole idea that the Irish were fighting against or fearful about economic competition, it does exist, and there are riots in places like Brooklyn and New Jersey and Newburgh, right, over economic competition in those areas, and that creates animosity, right? The Democratic leaders are riling the Irish up, they're going to battle, right? That even predates the 1863 riots in July, right? There's riots from the beginning of the war on, black on Irish riots. But you don't have that labor competition in places like Milwaukee or places in smaller communities in Illinois. In fact, most of the men who served in 17th Wisconsin probably never saw an African American before they enlisted, just looking at the communities, right? And so would they have been driven to reject politics because of a fear of labor competition as it looked on the ground in real life? No, they just wouldn't have, because it wouldn't have been on their radar. Right, and so I think that's part of why we see the rejection of the rioters as well in these areas, if that makes sense. I know that's a little bit different from your question, but nevertheless, I think it's an important point to make.